Shalom, and welcome to Inside Israel News. I'm your host, Mensch-Kight. In this podcast, you'll hear detailed and relatively unbiased information about Israeli politics and current events. So it's only been a few days since the last episode, and yet we've already got a lot of exciting news. So I'll just dive right in here and go head first into it. First and most exciting thing that's happened in Israel's election is Labor's back. A new left-wing party similar to the old Labor Party has been formed by Ron Huldai, the former mayor of Tel Aviv, or at least he's currently the mayor of Tel Aviv, but if he's about to be the former mayor of Tel Aviv. He's been mayor of Tel Aviv for 22 years and will now be moving on to national politics. Huldai said that he believed there should be a political party where people who don't feel they are served by the current political parties in the Knesset would have a home. And this is a more dovish party that is more pro-peace and more left. He's recruited a couple of interesting characters, some of the old Labor Party leaders like Amir Peretz, but also Nissenkorn, which Nissenkorn is the current justice minister. Avi Nissenkorn is with Blue and White at the moment, but he is now going to be going over to this new party, the Israelis party. So this is going to be interesting to see how this party develops. And when I get into the story a little bit more in depth in a minute here, I'll talk about who he's drawing voters from and how the polls look for the Israelis party. In a second bit of news, more excitement with the election is some of the things Gidon Sa'ar has been proposing. As the main sort of prime minister candidate opposing Bibi Netanyahu, Gidon Sa'ar is proposing alternative policies already. One thing he has said is that he plans to institute an 8-year limit for prime ministers. Not quite a term limit like we would think of over here where we have fixed terms, but just that no prime minister would be allowed to serve more than 8 years in office total. An interesting idea. Discuss it a little bit more later. He has also proposed a 2-term limit for mayors. You just heard me mention that Ron Huldai has been mayor of Tel Aviv for 22 years. When someone's been a mayor, an executive of a city like that for that long, they are very entrenched in power, and there's a tendency to be some corruption. I'm not accusing the former mayor of Tel Aviv. I'm just saying that this happens in a lot of Israeli cities, and oftentimes the Attorney General has to go after mayors for this issue. So this is an interesting thing that could change in Israel, that mayors may have term limits, and there may be a term limit or at least a maximum length of office for prime ministers. It could be an interesting change to the Israeli system. Gidon Sa'ar has also proposed increased decentralization. Israel is not really divided into states or large regions. There are 6 regional governments in Israel, and they are more like the counties are in most states in the United States, where the counties are more a means of implementing state policy at the local level or dividing up state institutions more than they are independent local government units. But Israel has a large number of cities and townships that are very local and are a good place to have greater political authority or political autonomy. So Gidon Sa'ar is proposing decentralizing some of the authority of the government to those regional councils and especially to the cities in Israel. This could be an interesting change for Israel as well. Israel is a very centralized government, very unitary. For example, the police force is a national institution, and Netanyahu himself has also proposed breaking down the police force into more local forces. And you think about here in the United States, especially how law enforcement works, it's really interesting to see that they serve local communities and they are beholden to the political leadership in those local communities. And as a result, being more accountable to local communities and local community needs, they enforce the law in different ways and to varying degrees of strictness. So that would be an interesting thing to see in Israel if police were able to enforce the law more locally and be more locally governed. As I've said before in this podcast, when it comes to Israeli elections, expect the unexpected. Just when you thought the old Israeli left was dead and buried, the fossils have returned to life. They've risen from the valley of dry bones, and they've been covered with flesh and sinew, and new life has been breathed into them. So the Labour Party, what I like to call the Labour Zombie Party, is back, and I don't mean that derisively, just that the Labour Party was essentially gone up until this point, and now Ron Hodai is resurrecting them from the dead, and I just thought it comical to make the reference to the Valley of the Dry Bones and talk about this particular episode in those terms. So Ron Hodai has been the mayor of Tel Aviv for a long time, 22 years. He's a very well-known figure and known for being part of labor and for being on the left, head of Israel's largest city, obviously. That metropolitan area is very left-leaning. And so the voters in Tel Aviv, who constitute a significant percentage of Israeli population, could give him seats in the Knesset just because he could represent their region, right? So this is an interesting aspect of Israeli politics. Again, they have a proportional system, so voters vote for political parties, but by creating a political party, that sort of narrow block that just the people of Tel Aviv could literally put Ron Hodai back into the national spotlight like that. And obviously he has supporters from elsewhere as well. Now, he's recruited Avi Nissenkorn, which is an interesting recruitment. Nissenkorn was recently with the Blue and White Party, and bringing him over to this party, along with some of the old guard of labor, like Amir Peretz, this creates kind of a broad, more center-left than the original Labor Party grouping of candidates, and it creates an opportunity for Hodai to reinvent the Israeli left. As I was talking about in previous podcasts, the current Israeli left, as we like to imagine them, are the center left, filling a hole created by Ariel Sharon in 2005 when he split off from Likud to form the Kadima party. And since then, several parties, Kadima ultimately collapsed under the less than excellent leadership of Ehud Olmert, who was later convicted on corruption charges, and that space has been filled by new political parties like Yesh Atid and Blue and White. Well, this party here kind of takes up a little bit of that space, but is pushing more to the left. They've drawn some votes from Meretz, the party I talked about before, and that party has fallen just a little bit in the polls, but not substantially. They're still polling at 5 or 6 seats, and the Israelis party is drawing votes from other parties. Now, they've taken a couple of seats from Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, the center-left party that I had talked about before, and they've also drawn a couple of seats away from Yaminah, which is interesting, that a number of people who were polling for Yaminah proportionally have moved over to the center left. And the big story, though, is that Gidon Sa'ar went down 4 seats. His party was polling at just over 20 seats, 21 seats, and they're down to 17 in recent polls. So the Israelis party, the Labor Zombie Party, if you will, is drawing from some interesting places. It is interesting to see how Israeli voters are responding to the new shift in politics as voters are moving away from Likud, led by Bibi Netanyahu, over his longevity in office and the corruption charges that he's facing, and the desire by a significant plurality of Israeli voters to see him out of office. And the fact that, as described in a previous episode, the pendulum of Israeli politics has swung very far to the right. And so it looks like the right bloc is going to take over 70 seats out of 120 in the Knesset and could possibly top 80 seats, 2/3 of the parliamentary body. And so seeing the left revived is interesting. I'm not sure that this party is going to have a huge effect on Israeli politics. Again, they've taken a few seats from different places as there's some excitement about Huldai's emergence in the national scene, the reemergence of a more dovish labor-style party. But that excitement could fade, and he could fall down a few percentage points. Now, it is interesting to see that even though the blue and white party is not hurting that much. They haven't changed much in the polls since the entrance of Huldai's party. The voters who left blue and white have left blue and white, and those who are supporting blue and white now are the strong supporters of Benny Gantz and the blue and white message, if you will. They're still polling at about 4 seats and are just clearing the threshold for entering the Israeli parliament, which is 3.25%. I may have said 3.5% in an early podcast. That's kind of a funny point of confusion. Yair Lapid, who proposed that reform to the electoral system, originally wanted a 3.5% threshold, and he couldn't quite get enough votes in order to pass it. Changing the election rules in Israel or making amendments to the basic law, which is kind of like their constitution, but not it's not as firm as a constitution. It can be amended at any time when a majority of the Knesset, an absolute majority, that is exactly 61 votes out of 120, vote to change it. And in that case, they had the amendment ready to go, and he couldn't quite get the votes to get 3.5%. So he compromised and brought it down to 3.25%, and then he was able to get enough votes. I'm one for making it even round numbers. I think 3% would be just fine for Israel personally, but 3.25% is where they set it, and it did have the desired effect that voters now vote for larger political parties. So with that correction made, now you know that it's 3.25% is the threshold, not 3.5%. Moving on to Gidon Sa'ar and his recent statements. Gidon Sa'ar said recently that his first act as prime minister, that the first thing the government would do, was establish an 8-year limit for prime ministers serving in the Israeli Knesset. Now, again, Israel does not have fixed elections, so it's not as if this is an actual 2-term limit. For example, the 22nd Amendment in the United States says that no one can be elected president more than twice, which is an 8-year limit because there is a fixed term of office for 8 years as president. That said, in Israel, there is not a fixed term. Governments can go a year, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, or can make it all the way to the 4-year limit if they are able to hold themselves together. So this is not a fixed thing, but the idea being that cumulatively, no one can serve as prime minister for more than 8 years. And it is going to be intriguing to see how that is going to be written and how that's going to be put together. Curiously, looking at Israeli politics in the past, only 2 prime ministers in Israel have served 8 years or more. The first, of course, being David Ben-Gurion, who spent about 13, almost 14 years in office. David Ben-Gurion, of course, is literally the founding father of Israel. He's Israel's George Washington. He founded the country, was part of that founding generation, was its first prime minister, and he led the country through its early years. The other prime minister, of course, who has served more than 8 years is Bibi Netanyahu, who is now over 11 years and working on his 12th, and cumulatively, because he served over 3 years before, has 14 years in office and is fast approaching 15. He's the longest-serving prime minister, having served in office longer than Ben-Gurion. But the fact is, only twice in Israeli history has a prime minister served more than 8 years. The other prime ministers, looking back, were able to serve, 4, 5, sometimes 6 years, and in occasions 7, but they did not last long enough to come to office and spend more than 8 years in office. So that limit would be, on the one hand, could be argued that, well, it would have very little impact on Israeli politics on the whole. It would just prevent someone from staying as long as Bibi Netanyahu. On the other hand, you could argue that it's not necessary because Israeli voters are fairly unforgiving. They are not easily attached to an individual prime minister. And in this particular case, through the difficult times that Israel has been led and under these unique circumstances, Netanyahu has been able to go this length of time in office. So we'll see how that goes. In the United States, of course, we'd only had 3 presidents who'd ever sought a third term, and none of them had been elected to one until Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran in 1940. And that was a very unique set of circumstances in American history as well. And of course, with the war on, he sought a 4th term and spent just a few weeks of that term in office before he died, leaving the presidency to Harry Truman. Of course, after the war, Congress, I want to say, may have overreacted a little bit and pushed the 22nd Amendment into ratification by 1951 to make sure that that would not happen for future presidents. Honestly, it really hasn't been a problem since then. By the time they get to 2 terms, most presidents are done being president. Well, the same has been true in Israeli politics. After 6 years, 7 years in office, having the big job, a lot of people are tired. Not to mention, as I said before, Israeli voters can be very unforgiving. Yitzhak Shamir had a very successful 6 years as prime minister, the first 2 as part of a unity government with Shimon Peres and Labor, and then a full 4-year term as the head of Likud from 1988 to 1992. But high unemployment and dissatisfaction with the economic situation brought an end to his government, and Yitzhak Rabin was elected prime minister, leading a labor government. So, that was an opportunity where if Israeli voters had been a little bit more forgiving and had been willing to say, okay, well, maybe the economy's not so great, but we'll give him 4 more years, where Shamir might have served more than 8 years in office. But obviously the voters didn't give him that opportunity. Now, speaking of term limits for mayors, Gidon Sa'ar said that mayors should have a 2-term limit. And this is a little bit different because for mayors in Israel, mayors do have fixed terms, more or less. And those terms would, a 2-term limit would mean an 8-year time in office in those cities. And as we see with Ron Huldai running for the head of the Israelis party and moving from the city level to the national level, politically speaking, that he's been mayor of Tel Aviv for 22 years, for a very long time. And Israel is known for having mayors who last many, many, many years in office. And in a number of cities, and I can add anecdotally that a friend of mine who works for a construction company in Israel, when going before mayors to talk about development plans, you'll often hear mayors strongly suggest that if, say, 200,000 or 300,000 shekels should make their way into a certain nonprofit that happens to employ members of that mayor's family and such, that might grease the wheels a little bit and make the city more likely to approve of a building project. And this is a fairly common thing in the cities there. And this is a big problem. And the state prosecutors have been chasing after mayors for doing this for some time. But it continues. And not every mayor can be prosecuted. And you get back to that big thing that, well, prove it, right? If you have a conversation between a group of people, proving the quid pro quo can be difficult. Obviously, those who are willing to give money to those nonprofits are not going to go testify about it afterwards and admit to having committed a crime. In very rare cases, whistleblowers will come forward, but those who are unwilling to give the money simply move on to other cities where they find cities that are more eager for development. So it would be interesting to see what a 2-term limit for mayor would do there. Certainly there would be more turnover in leadership at the city level. Now, Gidon Sa'ar has also proposed greater decentralization. This is a unique policy because it's not as political as a lot of the other policies are. Obviously, policies on the right, policies on the left, we're familiar with the usual struggles of austerity versus spending, higher spending. Austerity is the international term, or I want to say European political term for a balanced budget. We call it balancing the budget here in the U.S., but if you talk about it in any other country, they call it austerity or an austerity policy. So you'll hear them say, this government has a policy of austerity. Now, that means that they're trimming the budget, trying to eliminate their deficit and balance the budget. So those are typical issues, national security issues. Those guys, they're very political, and of course, the right has their take on it, and the left has their take on it. But decentralization is a little bit different. On the one hand, it is generally, at least in America, and in a few other countries, a generally right-wing idea that government should be more localized, although in a lot of countries the right is also just as statist as the left, but there are many political parties that advocate decentralization. They tend to be on the right, so Sa'ar is tapping into that. But at the same time, when you think about it, if you live in Tel Aviv, if you live in Givatayim, if you live in Ramat Gan, one of these left-leaning cities where there are not a lot of votes for the center-right, then decentralization means a more left-wing local government, even though there is a right-wing national government. And that can be a valuable thing as well. So how will Israeli voters respond to that? We haven't had any polls out since he made this announcement. And the most recent polls are just including the new Israelis party to the lot. But we'll see how this plays. This is an interesting new approach. Gidon Sa'ar is rising above the usual political fray, and he's pitching policies that are potentially more popular, or at least new ideas that may ring with the voters. So where are the polls and what's going on with the election overall, taking a step back from some of these more detailed issues? Before I go into those polls, I want to take a moment and take a look at the recent statements of Eyal Arad. Eyal Arad is a political strategist. He was with Likud. He moved with Sharon over to the Kadima party and has been associated with the center-left ever since. Arad had an interesting outlook on the election, talking about a number of different points that he thought people should understand. First of all, that Bibi isn't completely finished, even if a lot of people think he is. There are still chances for him to survive the election, and obviously the chances of an inconclusive election, which would lead to Bibi continuing in office anyway, are high as well. One point that he made that really should be emphasized at this point is that polls have shown at least half of Israelis are not entirely sure who they're voting for. So they're not quite set on what political party they're going to vote for. And another 30% who indicated a preference added the caveat that they're not 100% certain that that's how they're going to vote. So fully 8 in 10 Israeli voters are not completely certain how they're voting. That is a fascinating change to Israeli politics. Israelis are usually very certain. They'll put their foot down and say, hey, I'm voting for this party, definitely. I'm a Likudnik, or I'm with Labor, or I'm with Yair Lapid until the end of time, and they're very set. And there are a number of voters, like in any political system, where there are the middling sort who are centrist and lean one way or another. But fully 80% are not 100% sure how they're going to vote, and 50% are expressing even greater uncertainty. So polls have to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. Obviously, the election is early, so polls have a little less meaning right now. But I want to emphasize that point, that these are not hard and fast numbers, and they could change. Bibi could have an uptick in popularity himself. Gidon Sa'ar could take off. We've seen significant fluctuation with Yamina. Naftali Bennett was polling at upwards of 20 seats recently, 18, 19, 20 seats, and he's back down to about 13 now. So different polls have different results. Obviously, polls have a margin of error. Usually, polls of Israelis are pretty good because, as I've said, Israelis tend to be pretty certain about where they stand politically. But right now, with so much up in the air, with so much uncertainty about how the election's going to shake out, there's just a lot of people who aren't 100% certain. So that is a difference between this election and previous elections. Usually, some percentage, maybe 15, 20, 25% are uncertain or undecided or are willing to go one way or the other. Now it's a much larger chunk and are not completely certain how they're going to vote. And we will see how their preferences come out in the future. One other point that he made is that Bibi's popularity is falling even within Likud. There's a growing number of voices within the party and the party faithful who are calling for a leadership change, which will not necessarily affect or impact Netanyahu's career before the election, but should he come out the loser, that is, if a coalition is formed without Likud and without Bibi at its head, that could definitely lead to his ouster as party leader. The next contender for the party leadership, a very popular contender now that Sa'ar has left, is Nir Barkat. Barkat is the former mayor of Jerusalem and very popular with the center-right. He would be somebody that would be acceptable to Likud, and another mayor making his way to the national fray. Could Nir Barkat become the leader of Likud within the next few months, prior to or even after the election? That's for anyone to say. One thing Bibi Netanyahu might do, if he really wanted to sabotage Gidon Sa'ar, would be to announce his retirement after the election. Basically say, as soon as the next government is formed, I will quit. And by so doing, focus his attacks on diminishing Gidon Sa'ar in the face of Nir Barkat. Basically, as all of these defectors have left Likud, he could try to punish them by diminishing their votes and trying to promote his preferred successor. Right, so on to the polls themselves. This most recent poll was published by Panels Research for a radio station in Israel. Obviously, it has a margin of error, and again, that's all largely irrelevant as large numbers of Israeli voters aren't certain how they're going to vote, but it does give us a snapshot of where things stand at the moment with those who are willing to give a preference. In that poll, Likud is polling at 26. Likud is the large center-right party led by Bibi Netanyahu, and he needs more votes than that, more seats than 26 in order to win. Again, these are proportions of seats that they're polling out of 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset, because it's a multi-party proportional parliamentary system. The Shas party, which is the Sephardic Orthodox Party, is polling at 8 seats. United Torah Judaism, which is the Ashkenazic Orthodox Party, is polling at 7. So those parties most closely aligned with Bibi Netanyahu, who would be willing to serve in a coalition with him very easily, are polling at 41 seats in total in this particular poll. Now, Gidon Sa'ar's New Hope Party is polling at 17 seats. Yamina, the Naftali Bennett's center-right party, is the National Religious Party, essentially, is polling at 13. And Yisrael Beitenu, the Russian rightist party, is polling at 8. So those three would be eager to work together, being center-right, against Bibi Netanyahu. They are polling at 38 seats. And again, you can see all of these parties are the center-right in Israel, or what is called in Israeli politics the right bloc. And at this point, we have 41 for Netanyahu and 38 for Gidon Sa'ar or Naftali Bennett. That's 79 seats right there. So, I mean, that's almost 2/3 of the Knesset, speaking of that pendulum. So let's talk about the left. The center-left Yesh Atid, Future Party, led by Yair Lapid, is at 12 seats. The Israelis Party, led by Ron Huldai, the zombie Labor Party, as I like to call them with all due affection, is polling at 8. And Meretz, the old far-left party, is polling at 5. Blue and White is currently polling at 4 seats, but I have to stress they are polling right in terms of voter percentage, right at the 3.25% threshold. So I have to put the little caveat or asterisk there that they'll get 4 seats if they clear the threshold. And that makes 29 seats for the center-left. So you can see that the center-left is considerably diminished. Now, the Arab Joint List is polling at 12 seats. As I mentioned before, the Arabs do not participate in governments or recommend prime ministers or do any of the things that lead to the forming of coalitions, and they don't join coalitions. So they aren't entirely relevant. So what you can see here is if a coalition is going to come together against Netanyahu, that's going to get Netanyahu out, it's going to be very difficult to form looking at these numbers. Sa'ar and his natural allies are at most 38 seats, about 1/3 of the Knesset, but they would need a significant number of those 29 seats on the center-left. Say, at this point, Yesh Atid and the Israelis Party together would give them 20 seats and put them just beneath the 61 seats that they need. Right, they'd have to bring in Blue and White with Benny Gantz or one of the Orthodox religious parties if they were willing to break from Netanyahu, or Meretz. But it's difficult to imagine Meretz serving in a coalition led by Gidon Sa'ar. They're not going to like that. So it's difficult imagining Israelis serving in such a coalition. Of course, once that coalition is formed and a new government comes into office and Netanyahu falls from prime minister to being opposition leader or just the leader of a large party, he will most likely have to leave politics for a time to face the charges that he's been charged with, the fraud, corruption charges. But he could try to stick around and continue to lead Likud. There's a good chance he'll beat those charges in trial, although that's a long process. But this coalition, no matter which way it's put together, is going to be weak, and it's going to be difficult to hold it together. Would a Likud led by Nir Barkat, after Netanyahu has left, be willing to join the coalition and stabilize it, eliminating the need for center-left parties? That's anyone's guess. At this point, though, with Netanyahu trying to hold on to power, we still have to consider that before we contemplate anything else. So at this point, the reason a lot of people are saying that a fifth election is possible, that inconclusive election is likely, is this very situation. Because if you look at these numbers, with 38 right bloc parties unwilling to form a government with Netanyahu, and 41 willing to do so, not willing to join anyone else's government, and the center-left being unwilling to sit in government with far-right leaders, that's just not going to add up to an easy government. And even if you could put together that government we were just talking about, led by Sa'ar, with New Hope, Yamina, Yisrael Beitenu, Yesh Atid, Israelis, and Blue and White, what a mouthful, with all of those political parties, any one of them feeling unsatisfied with the political situation or seeing a little bump for themselves in the ongoing polls in politics, feeling like, you know what, if we had new elections, I could get, 5 or 6 more seats and have a little more influence, that means that they'd have the ability to leave the government. And several of these parties, from Yamina with Naftali Bennett to Yair Lapid, have been willing to leave coalitions in the past on principle. So again, polls come with a grain of salt, but when you look at it, you can see why, in all likelihood, this election could turn out entirely inconclusive. Well, that concludes yet another exciting episode of Inside Israel News. Please look us up on Facebook, like the page, website coming soon, which will give you a chance to stay updated between episodes on the latest in Israeli news, and you'll find every episode there, ready and waiting as soon as it is posted. With that, I will bid you farewell. Goodbye. Lehitraot.
אולי נפליגה בספינות מחוף אילת עד חוף שלהם ועל המשחטות הישנות יטעינו תפוחי זהב